My name is David Castillo. I'm the director of the UB Humanities Institute. In the name of the Institute, the Festival Steering Committee, and our partner institutions, SUNY Buffalo State, Canisius College, and Niagara University, I would like to welcome you officially to the 2019 Buffalo Humanities Festival on Democracy. Boy, this is going to be a good one. I can feel the energy. This is a 3-day event that includes tomorrow's spotlight talk and book signing by best-selling author and journalist Matt Taibbi, who returns to Buffalo to speak on the subject of his timely book, Hate, Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. We were told that the book was forthcoming in October, but then walking in, I realized that our friends from Talking Leaves somehow have managed to get copies of the book. Hot off the press. Thanks to Talking Leaf, of course. The festival will conclude on Saturday with a full-day extravaganza that looks at this year's theme from every conceivable angle, including a 10:30 a.m. plenary panel in which Taibbi will join several local journalists to discuss the future of information and democracy, with a special emphasis on the local level. A word of thanks to our Humanities New York friends, Michael Washburn, who couldn't be here with us today, Joe Murphy, who is filling in for him, Sarah Auger, Sarah Kearney, who is the first chair of Humanities New York from the Western New York region, and their dedicated team of magicians for once again organizing this inaugural festival day. And of course, a very special thanks to our distinguished panelists, Ibram Kendi and Chenjerai Kumanyika, who will lead this timely and urgent conversation on democracy and the legacy of racism. And now, please help me welcome Sarah Kearney.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you so much, David, the University of Buffalo, and the UB Humanities Institute. Thank you to Maki Tanigaki for your annual efforts and support of this extra special event. My name is Sarah Kearney, and I proudly chair the Board of Directors of Humanities New York, or as some of you know us, we are the New York Council for the Humanities. And our wonderful staff and board members are also here tonight. I hope that you'll get a chance to meet them. Thank you. We are so proud of our long-standing commitment and annual sponsorship support of the Buffalo Humanities Festival since its inception. This is truly one of the cultural and intellectual highlights of our year. And if you're looking for a powerful, eloquent argument for the enduring vitality and importance of the humanities, for the role that the humanities play in fostering civil discourse, you could not find a better example. We call ourselves cultural first responders. And tonight, it's going to be wonderful. Again, thank you to everyone who helped create, design, and build this weekend. Humanities New York is an independent 501c3 and a top-tier leader and state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We provide leadership and support across the state's intellectual and cultural sectors through grants, programs, civic projects, community engagement, and advocacy, which encourages critical thinking and understanding. We execute our mission on two primary paths. First, we function as a foundation, providing money to a wide variety of diverse organizations throughout all 10 regions of New York State. And this funding is often the only chance for libraries, museums, galleries, educational institutions, churches, historical societies. It's only chance to use tools like those provided by the humanities to bolster and broaden their own audiences and to advance their missions. The other half of Humanities New York is direct service programs. This includes our community conversations and reading and discussion programs. This also includes our special initiatives, including our efforts to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage in 2020, as well as our new effort called Look Inside, which uses the tools of the humanities to examine New York State's prison experience with a wider lens. Humanities New York has a mission to help New Yorkers form and articulate their ideas and beliefs, develop critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, and problem-solving skills, and to help us talk about and understand the ideas that define us as individuals and connect us to our communities using a basic set of tools for improving civic life. The most basic of these tools should be ubiquitous, but remain difficult to encourage open, frank, substantive dialogue about the hopes, anxieties, and obstacles that unite or divide us. Humanities New York and I are in the conversation business. It's our belief, supported by our years of work in the field, that conversation and the mere act of attributing sincerity to people you disagree with can help you better understand the differences perceived and actual between you and your neighbors. This understanding is essential to a healthy civic life. Which brings me to tonight's event. We are here for Democracy and the Legacy of Racism, which will be a conversation. How has the development of democracy in America been linked to the persistence of American racism? You are going to be a big part of the conversation. In order to draw on the experience both on the stage and in the room, we're going to structure this differently than a standard panel. This presentation will partly be broken down into 3 sections, and then there will be followed by Q&A. First, we discuss the shift from racism as an attitude to racism as a policy. Second, we will discuss what we're calling notions of behavioral racism and the culture of poverty. Last, we will discuss the essential connection between American racism and American capitalism. After each of these sections, we will have an audience Q&A for about 10 minutes. Since we do not have a lot of time and we want to hear a lot of voices, you'll be able to line up at a microphone. And please keep your questions brief, under 30 seconds. We are going to start with something first. I'm going to ask all of you a question, and I'd like you to turn to your neighbor, preferably the one you do not know, and discuss your answer for a few minutes. The question is, what about the topic of tonight's conversation is important to you? What do you think is important? Why do you think it is important? And please think on that for a moment and then turn to your neighbor and discuss your thoughts for just a few minutes. Get ready to speak freely. I'll interrupt in a moment. Ready, set, talk. Hi, Brenda. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We love the sound of inspired conversation. Ready? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And tonight, I have the pleasure. It's great. All right, I'll have to ask you to... Thank you. Sorry, I love it. We're very inspired, and we'll have more time to talk in our conversation, so thank you. But to move us along, tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Ibram Kendi is the founding director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University, where he is also a professor of history and international relations. He is the author of the National Book Award-winning Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and the recently published How to Be an Anti-Racist. Chenjerai Kumanyika is a researcher, journalist, artist, and assistant professor in Rutgers Department of Journalism and Media Studies, where he works on the intersection of social justice and emerging media. He's also the co-executive producer and co-host of Uncivil, an award-winning podcast about the Civil War and its enduring relevance to our contemporary American life. And there's a bar. And again, thank you to Talking Leaves. After the event, Talking Leaves will be selling copies of Ibram's books. He will also be signing copies. Thank you again for coming out tonight. Please join me in welcoming to Buffalo, New York, Ibram Kendi and Chenjerai Kumanyika.
Hey, how you doing?
Thank you.
All right. Can everyone hear us? Yes. All right. Welcome. And thank you to Humanities New York for inviting myself and Dr. Kendi. I just want to say, I think it's really important during these times. These are trying times for us where so many of us are suffering in real ways at the intersection of various regimes of power and ignorance and consciousness. And I think I'm thankful that we have a chance to come and to think through these things, because I think that this is a crucial part of us thinking about what we're going to do about all of this. And so I just want to extend my gratitude in that way. I'm really, one of the cool things about my job and about an opportunity like this is that I get to sit with scholars who I really respect and be able to ask the things that I'm interested in. So, and you get to watch and then and then participate. I guess we have, I think we, as with in the intro we talked about, we have some themes that we're going to puzzle through, and I really look forward to your questions on those themes. But let me start off like this. So I was a contributor to a podcast called Seeing White. I don't know if any of you have heard that. Thank you. So, John Biewen, who's a brilliant dude, he and I were talking about it. He's like, Chenjerai, you want to make a podcast with me where we talk about race, like a black guy and a white guy having the dialogue? And I was kind of like, And one reason was because I said, the first thing is I said, I'm a media studies scholar, right? So I'm very interested in race and in history, but there are people who actually do that work for real as scholars. They're out in archives and doing the super unsexy work that it takes to be a real historian. And often in these conversations about race, you ever notice in race, they just grab anybody? I mean, I don't want not to diss Charles Barkley, but I saw a CNN special was Charles Barkley discusses race. I mean, Charles Barkley has something to say about race. Not to diss him, but. So anyway, John told me, well, we discussed, he said, I'm interviewing Dr. Ibram Kendi. And that was how I first encountered your book. In that way, and I was like, I had heard of the book, but I hadn't really, now that my white friend had already read the whole book, I was like, I got to catch up on that, And when he told me about it, it was like, yeah, it's a history of racist ideas, and at that point I was kind of like, yeah, okay, that's cool, I feel like I kind of I kind of got that on Smash already. You know, I know the basic moves there. Boy, was I wrong. So just to start off with this first theme, right? I want to quote something that you say. Oh, there's one more thing I got to do before I get into the Q&A, so just give me 1 second. This new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I've spent the last 2 weeks with it. It is really an incredible and pleasurable read. I mean, it's a book that I think some of these concepts, to understand them, we have to see them in action in people's autobiography. And without giving too much away, I just want to say that Dr. Kendi does this brilliantly, and he also includes so much important history, which sometimes he'll render like really succinctly in the space of like 3 pages. So it's just an excellent book. My copy is marked up, dog-eared, everything, highlighted. And so I really encourage you, if you're not already familiar, to read and grab this book. So in the book, one of the things you say here is that you have been taught racist ideas cause racist policies, that ignorance and hate cause racist ideas, and that the root problem of racism is ignorance and hate. Now, that to me is like a really common idea. Has anybody else heard that before? Right? And just out of show of hands? Right? The problem is ignorance, and that's behind the policies because we're ignorant. So could you just say something about where you first heard that and what history started to undo that for you?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm excited to be here, and thank you so much for moderating this talk. Of course, thank you Humanities New York. So I mean, that when I was writing Stand from the Beginning, or I should say when I was researching for it, I was expecting to sort of write a pretty standard narrative in which you had these producers of racist ideas producing them because they just didn't know any better. They were ignorant, or they in some ways hated black people. That's what I expected to find, because that's what we're commonly taught. And I think we've been taught that really since, for those of us who learn about race and racism in high school or even middle school, most of us in college, we're taught that the fundamental issue is hate and ignorance. Even when someone today who's powerful says a racist idea, one of the common responses is, oh, he or she is so ignorant, which means that that idea is coming out of that person's ignorance, right? And so, you know, I expected to find that ignorance. It just so happened that the people who I was chronicling were a who's who of American intellectuals, were the most brilliant American minds in history. And so what's ironic is, so I couldn't first rationalize how I was essentially chronicling a who's who of brilliance. Right. In other words, they're smart over here, but apparently they're stupid about race. And so I was trying to sort of understand that. And then eventually I began to realize that they used their brilliance to fabricate and create racist ideas to justify existing racist policies that typically benefited them, right? So y'all know that person you argue with who, you know, they just use their brilliance to just come up with a better and better argument, all the while they know they're wrong. I mean, it's essentially like that. And I found that really not the core wasn't ignorance and hate, that the core of this racism problem was in fact self-interest. And that you essentially had, from the beginning, you had slave traders and slaveholders who were slave trading and slaveholding because they wanted to make money. And then when people resisted the racist policies that allowed them to make money off of enslaved black labor, they didn't say, oh, well, I guess what we're doing is wrong. No, they said, no, actually, slavery is good for black people. They're the cursed descendants of Ham. This is natural for black people. Black people are meant to be like animals picking, while of course we're meant to be like humans supervising. I mean, these types of ideas were used to defend the policies that benefited them. In the way today, you have politicians who are instituting voter ID laws to get into office or maintain office, and then they're creating the justification of voter fraud. And then when we actually show them, actually, voter fraud is a non-existent problem. You know, in billions and billions of people who've cast ballots, we've only been able to find a handful of voter fraud cases. Then they say, well, actually, it was even worse than I originally thought. Which means that the idea actually did not come out of ignorance. They knew from the beginning, and I think that's been very difficult for people to understand because we've been taught the opposite, and then we're like, whoa, people can be that evil? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think this is so important, and you know, one of the ways that I try to think through this, you know, a scholar named Barbara Fields in a book called Racecraft talks about the fact that, you know, in slavery, the goal wasn't to produce racism, it was to produce sugar and tobacco and all these other things that were being produced. And you know, this is kind of a tricky thing because I think that in the efforts, you know, we have a history that has marginalized race or made race look kind of like an accident. And I think that in the effort to center race again, it becomes tricky sometimes because we can mystify the thing that is clarified in your work, which is the way that race is used to justify material exploitation and economic exploitation, right? This is not to reduce race to economics or anything like that, but it is to say what actually is motivating the racist policy, right? So for example, in Philadelphia, where we have tremendous problems with our schools that exist really around the country right now, in our cities, you know, there's a racist outcome of the school policies, right? And I would call the policies that govern the funding of schools in Philadelphia, I would call them racist, right? But what you look at when you look at what has actually robbed the school budget in Philadelphia of the funds that are needed, what you find is that it is a big block of real estate capital is one, people who would like to turn existing public schools into condo space, right? People who do not want to pay taxes that they're paying. So what you have is a variety of major stakeholders like the University of Pennsylvania, like Drexel, who aren't paying taxes and robbing literally the city budget of millions of dollars. Now that has a racial outcome, a racist impact, but it is actually resulting in that case, in that instance, from these other kinds of policies. And so you introduce us to this wonderful vocabulary that really I think is a central vocabulary for democracy, which you offer in this book, right? It's a bunch of terms that I think that we cannot actually envision democracy without the kinds of terms that you're introducing. So let's just kind of go with some of the basics just to lay it out, particularly for people who are not familiar. You talk about how do you define an anti-racist versus a racist?
Sure. So I define an anti-racist as someone who is expressing an anti-racist idea or supporting an anti-racist policy with their action. And I define a racist as someone who is expressing a racist idea or supporting a racist policy with their action or even inaction. To really break down those, so they're fundamentally direct opposites. But what's similar about both definitions is the opening part of someone who is. We've been taught this idea that a racist is like a fixed category. It's like an identity. It's like a tattoo. It's literally who a person is. It's in a person's bones. It's in a person's heart. Y'all have heard any of this recently? And
especially the bones.
Yes.
A lot of them. And they have a racist bone in his body.
Yeah, so we apparently got to do CT scans and X-rays to figure out whether people are racist. And so what that means, is we've been taught it's essential to who a person is. And that's just not true. What oftentimes is the case with humans is humans are deeply complex and contradictory. And so in certain ways, historically, most Americans seemingly, when it comes to different racial groups or different issues, they're being racist or anti-racist. Or to give an example, I've chronicled in my work how the same speaker in the same speech, in the same paragraph of the same speech, would say both racist and anti-racist ideas.
Wow.
So then how do you characterize that speech? How do you characterize that person? You can't characterize them as racist or anti-racist because they said both racist and anti-racist ideas. But what you can do is you can say at the beginning of the paragraph, when they were expressing that anti-racist idea, they were being anti-racist. At the end of the paragraph, when they were saying that racist idea, they were being racist. You see the way that sort of works. And so
I don't know, why not to interrupt, but at one point in the book you say, you can't become an anti-racist. No. And I paused on that because I was like, I think a lot of us, I think that's a challenge. So could you see it?
Well, first, to say that somebody becomes a racist is to suggest that they don't ever have the capacity to be anything else, to be an anti-racist. And to suggest that someone becomes an anti-racist is to suggest that people in this society, in societies across the world, are not raised to be racist, are not raised addicted to racism. Racism is not essentially, has not necessarily become almost like a personality characteristic. In other words, when people decide to strive to be anti-racist, it's literally something that they have to do on a moment-by-moment, day-by-day basis. Because if you're raised to think that there's something wrong with a particular racial group, if you're raised to imagine that inequities are the result of inferior or superior peoples, you can't just flip on a switch one day and leave all those ideas behind. It literally is, if you were raised to see young black males as dangerous, and then one day you realize, you know what, young black males are not dangerous, you can't just flip on the switch one day and never, when you're walking by a young black male, do you have any fear. That just doesn't work. And so what happens is the person, on a moment-by-moment, day-by-day basis, has to strive to be anti-racist, has to literally seek to overcome their addiction, has to seek to literally overcome the personality characteristics that's been ingrained in them. And like anybody who's basically overcoming an addiction, nobody who overcomes it, like you can't say, oh, I'm done with that addiction. No, it's literally something that you have to strive to do every day. And really quickly, key to that definition is also racist and anti-racist idea. And so a racist idea is any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. In our time, we don't say superior and inferior, we say this is what's wrong with black people. We also, when I say racial group, I'm not just referring to, let's say, black people or Asian people. I'm talking about Asian women are a racial group. The black poor are a racial group. Latinx lesbians are a racial group. And so anytime we say this is what's wrong with a racial group, we are expressing a racist idea. In contrast, anti-racist ideas suggest that there's nothing wrong or even right with any of the racial groups, that the racial groups are literally equal, even amid their differences. And so an anti-racist recognizes cultural differences, aesthetic differences, and when they see those differences, all they're seeing is differences. They're not ranking those differences. They're not assessing those differences from their own aesthetic or even cultural standards, which then imagines that other culture that they're judging from their own standards is inferior because they're not like them. That imagines that beauty standard is inferior to their own because it's not like them. Anti-racists don't do that. They embrace difference. While racists essentially have created a scenario in which if you're not like them, if you don't look like them, if you don't act like them, if you don't behave like them, if you don't love like them, then there's something wrong with you. And either you should stay away or you should assimilate to be like them.
Let me just say, wow, thank you. I was so glad to, by the way, have a book when you were explaining this, so I could like rewind, slow down, and just process it, because these are such important things and they're so confusing in our popular discourse. Yeah. You know, one thing I would say is, one thing that really has helped me to grasp some pieces of the concepts and of these ideas about race and racial groups and their place in democracy is looking at how race was legalized and institutionalized starting in the 17th century. You know, really between the 17th and 19th century is for me the most interesting period, right? Because if you think about it, you know, one of the things that struck me in my own historical, you know, learning was like the idea of a Caucasian basically did not even exist until around the time when America was gaining independence. Like, so all the things that happened in America before that, there wasn't a concept of a Caucasian, right? Like that word is rooted to a particular scientific trajectory. That's not to say racial ideas didn't exist till then. But what you see is a series of laws, and a great resource on this is called White by Law by Ian Haney Lopez. And it talks about how, through law, these groups were sort of created together. And obviously, Dr. Kendi's books talks about this. So could you talk about a little bit about some of the history that helped you to sort through and understand how this puzzle, because it really is a puzzle in a way. To talk about racial groups is kind of a puzzle. And in a way, as a teacher, right, as an organizer, sometimes I have to take a position where I'm just like, I have to tell, you know, sometimes as an organizer, I just got to tell white people, listen, here's the books to read, I'll talk to you later, right, you know. But, like, but as a professor, I'm very patient because it is a puzzle. Even to talk about racial groups, these groups are constructed, right? They're not biologically real groups. But then we still have to refer to them because they've been legislated and institutionalized to be real, so they are real. So you can't just get out of the puzzle by saying, oh, they're not real. So we talk about racial groups, we're talking about a fictitious entity. And I thought that some of the history you laid down that shows the historical creation of these groups really helped to clarify that. Could you talk about some of the most important moments for you in that process?
Well, I think if we want to go back to the origins of race as a concept, of racist ideas, of racist policies, we would essentially go to the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. And the Portuguese were pretty much the first Western European power to begin leaving essentially Europe via the Atlantic and went into Africa and essentially captured, or I should say kidnapped, African people, and initially brought them back to Portugal, but eventually started selling them to Spanish colonists who by the 1500s were, of course, colonizing the Americas. When Prince Henry the Navigator was essentially the person who financed Portuguese exploration, as they would call it, into Western Africa. And the reason he did that is because historically Western Europeans were slave trading in sub-Saharan Africans, but typically having to use Muslim middlemen who were essentially capturing African people via the trans-Saharan slave trade and then essentially bringing them up to the Mediterranean. And so he was like, let's just go around these middlemen and go right to the source. And we then can then sell them to other Western European powers and basically become rich. But in order to do so, he had to justify the exclusive enslavement of African people. Other slave traders at the time in the 1400s were slave trading in Eastern European Slavs, were slave trading in people from the Middle East, were slave trading in sub-Saharan Africans, were slave trading in everybody in terms of from a color standpoint.
Right, the word slave comes from the word Slav.
Precisely,
right?
because
that's huge, you know.
It wasn't until the 1400s, and especially the 1500s, that a group other than the Slavs were predominating in Western European slave markets. And so the Portuguese had to justify why they were enslaving exclusively all of these different looking African people who essentially came from different ethnic groups, had different skin colors, were essentially very different people. And the way he went about doing that, or I should say the way Gomez Zurara went about doing that, who essentially wrote a biography of Prince Henry's dealings in Africa after being commissioned by the king to do so, the king who was essentially Prince Henry's nephew, the way he went about doing that, Gomez Zurara, was essentially stating they're one people. They're one race, one black race that's worthy of enslavement. And they're worthy of enslavement because they're like beasts. And so what Prince Henry is doing, Pope, is he's actually going into West Africa and capturing these people to bring them to Christ, to bring them to civilization.
This is the justification.
This is the justification. And so essentially he had to make a people, a race, and he essentially had to justify that he was helping them. In order to make a case you're helping somebody, you have to make a case that they need help. In order to make a case someone needs help, you have to make a case that someone has a problem. And so all of this became baked. In his biography of Prince Henry, I'm talking about Gomez Zurara, which was ultimately published in 1453. And the Portuguese led the way in the slave trading of exclusive slave trading of African people, led the way in what became known as the transatlantic slave trade. So when the French, Dutch, and British started slave trading by the end of the 1500s, they went to the source, who apparently knew everything about Africa, the Portuguese. And so then they began justifying their slave trading with the same ideas that these people were beasts, they were worthy of enslavement, and we're going to civilize them and Christianize them. And of course, the similar ideas were used to justify the enslavement of these people when they, of course, were carried over to the Americas.
And I think that, yeah, that was huge. That was one of those things. I was like, oh, so we just have an actual historical point when this thing started. I mean, I thought it was one of the brilliant things that Stamped from the beginning brought. In an episode of Uncivil called The Sentence, we trace the architecture of racial laws in the United States. And again, what you see is a similar kind of thing. You see justifications, right? You see problems of slavery, really, problems of labor and justifications unfolding. I just want to wrap up this section by saying that, I think that this takeaway is really important for us to understand that it doesn't come, that these ideas don't come from ignorance. In a way, what you just described is a kind of knowledge that Zurara produced, right? It's a form of knowledge that justifies, that winds up justifying the slave trade and has this long legacy. So there's many other things I want to say, but at some point I want to get you all in on the conversation, so I'll just stop there.
Well, just this last point is just really exciting to me. And I don't know that it needs clarity, but I was always under the impression that the African nations that have been there kind of forever were chopped up like after the various, much later, like when the French came in, or when all the other countries came in and took their share of all of them, and they made all the, the African countries we have today. And it's amazing to me that it goes back much further, where someone came along and said, just what you just explained. Oh, we just have to make them all alike, and we need to help them. I mean, so it goes back to what, the 14th century?
15th century.
15th century. Yes. I mean, yeah. It's just, so I don't have a question, but it's just, it's another step of enlightenment as far as how it continues to work.
Yeah, the slave trade roughly lasted for, what we know as the transatlantic slave trade, roughly lasted for 400 years.
For how many?
400 years.
Yes, yes.
So from the 1400s to the mid to late 1800s. I think what you're talking about in terms of when European nations got together in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 to essentially, and they took out a map of Africa and started essentially drawing the countries that we know now and
Right.
simultaneously choosing which nation would, of course, colonize which nation. I think
Right.
that you're talking about the famous Berlin Conference that then justified their colonization by stating that, okay, you civilize these people, you civilize these people, and we'll all be doing good in Africa.
Right, right.
Yeah, and I think, and just the only piece I would add to that is, at the moment when the Portuguese arrived, African nations did see themselves as a variety of different peoples,
Sure,
but they just weren't those peoples. They were different nations. The continent was organized in different ways. The kinship groups were structured in various different kinds of geographies, and that winds up leading to problems later. So, but it was different groups. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Blessed love. My question is, those of us who don't want to stay captured by the ignorance of this racist structure that we've inherited, how do we free ourselves from the kind of language that we all use in terms of calling it a slave trade rather than calling it human trafficking, in terms of calling our ancestors slaves rather than human beings, in terms of that whole structure of black-white nonsense as opposed to just human beings. How do those of us who want to escape that captivity of the language that we've inherited, how do we grow past that to the point that we can begin to see each other as human beings?
I would love to hear what Dr. Kendi has to say. What I'll say briefly on it, thank you for this question. Language matters, and I think that in a society like the United States, which has actually a history of anti-intellectualism, there can be a way to marginalize and to act like language doesn't matter, or someone who's talking about language is just engaging in semantics. But these words really they help us to understand things. So you're right, to talk about human trafficking is important. To talk about enslavement as opposed to just slaves. I mean, I had to go back when I was making Uncivil and delete the word freed slave out of every script. The idea that slavery is something that marks a person, that you're still a slave even after you're free, and all these other kinds of things. So I think that these words are important. I would say though, in organizing and in our broader projects of mass political education, which I hope we all should be involved in, I do think we have to have a sense of compassion, right? Because we have egos. I mean, I'm someone who, I still battle with my ego all the time. In an earlier version of myself, I would have loved to shout down people who were using the wrong words. No, brother, it should be this, it should be that, it should be this. And I find that what that does is that approach to it is not helpful, I think, right? I think we have to, sometimes if we're being compassionate, we can understand what someone means. We can raise questions, and I think that's important.
And I'll say very, very quickly that the use of the term black and white, if we stopped identifying as black and white and Latinx and Native and Asian, and we stopped thereby collecting statistics, racial statistics of people who identify as such, then we won't be able to identify and even see racial inequities. And if we can't see racial inequities, we can't identify the racist policies that are causing those racial inequities. And if we can't identify racist policies that are causing those inequities, then racism will persist and we won't be able to see it, let alone fight it. And actually, racist power currently, their final solution is actually for us to not identify racially, precisely so we can have inequity that we can't see.
So my question is about how much religion in the early part of our country here solidified this need for racism, the need for the division between people, the need to have the hierarchy between people? Did it have an effect, or was it already so baked in that by the time there needed to be a religious reason for it, justification for it, that it was already so baked in and it really just fit together with the religion?
So when you think about ideas and scholarship, ideas and scholarship in the Western world, in colonial America, in the United States, was largely theological ideas. You know, as it wasn't until people like Thomas Jefferson began to sort of secularize intellectual thought. And of course, that's not till the late 1700s, early 1800s. The two earliest debates between racists were actually over religion. And so one group of racists were known as what I call curse theorists. And essentially, they stated that blackness, ugly blackness, enslaved blackness, was due to black people being the cursed descendants of Ham. While climate theorists made the case that blackness was the result of the hot sun of Africa.
Right.
That Adam and Eve were essentially born in Europe. The Garden of Eden was in Europe. And the descendants, the white descendants of Adam and Eve, at some point, according to this logic, ventured into Africa. And their beautiful white skins were burnt black by the hot sun. And that's how blackness emerged. And so that meant, for curse theorists, that blackness was not essential and permanent, while curse theorists were like, no, it is permanent because it's a curse. So curse theorists were like, you know what, to heal blackness, to get rid of the Negro problem, let's urge black people to move back up to cooler climates, where their ugly black skins will become white again. These ideas, these curse theorists, actually dominated intellectual thought, racial thought in the United States in the 1770s and 1780s when this nation was being founded. So actually, Samuel Stanhope Smith, who was probably one of the leading curse theorists, I should say climate theorists, gave a lecture to what was known as the American Philosophical Society in January of 1787 to some of the same men who would go on later that year to write the US Constitution. And he essentially made this case. And so this is what people believed. And so when they came across black people who had vitiligo, they would say, you know what? You must have been up north and you're becoming white again. And you are essentially the future of America and American democracy. Because what's ruining American democracy is blackness.
Wow. All right, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm halfway through Stanford from the beginning, and I'm fascinated with the conversation you have about Cotton Mather and whether or not blacks could be Christianized. It's just fascinating, and I love you waking up all this history. But you were talking about becoming an anti-racist. I joined the Army in 1954. And I trained from Buffalo with a detail of 4 men led by a black sergeant who was re-upping. And he and I discussed America all the way from Buffalo to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to Louisville, Kentucky. And I was raised in the country. I grew up where Gettysville is now. And I didn't know anything about race or anything. And we got off the train, and my new friend almost ran to the other end of the platform, and I was grouped with a bunch of white recruits. And we got into separate buses and went, and I was introduced to Jim Crow that day. They had the black toilet, the colored toilets, I guess they call them, and white toilets, and the white toilets were fancy and ceramic, and the black toilets were outhouses.
It wasn't
and it was
separate,
really, that was at Louisville Railroad Station. So I became an anti-racist immediately. So it can be done.
Hi. So I grew up in the Caribbean, and I feel like I learned a different history of my blackness. So my question is, what is it about the American education system that is creating this distorted history? Because I learned in first grade that my race was the first revolution I learned about was the Haitian Revolution. I learned this when I was 6. So if you could talk about the American education system so I could kind of understand this, it would be nice.
So actually, I think Haiti is a unique nation in the entire Western Hemisphere, as you know, due to the Haitian Revolution. And because of the Haitian Revolution, and since the Haitian Revolution, Haitians have been teaching other Haitians, about sort of the greatness of Haitians, specifically because they were the first black republic. And as a result, Haiti did not have to face colonization in the way other Caribbean islands did. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that I think you lived, fortunately, in a very unique nation as a result of Haiti's history. And I think in other islands, as well as in the United States, the sort of education is largely a colonial education. And what I mean by that in terms of a colonial education is, we're largely taught, even black kids who go to black schools, we're largely taught white writers. We're largely sort of taught a Eurocentric curriculum. We're largely taught that we should clap for Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King, and they're the only black people who ever lived in this country. But that, we were freed by abolitionists, and we were given our civil rights in the 1960s. And so, as a result, we have long been headed towards our ideals. And clearly, like with any other difficult thing, it takes time. But we're headed in that direction. And when one person stepped into one office in 2009, we suddenly became post-racial. And then when another person replaced him, he became the embodiment of racism. Nobody else is racist. And so this is really the sort of colonial history we're taught in this country. But we're also taught here, as I suspect my Haitian friends tell me about this in Haiti, is we're also taught this idea that light-skinned blacks are superior to darker-skinned blacks. And the reason why light-skinned blacks have more is because they are more. And so that colorism obviously exists in the Caribbean and in Haiti, and we're sort of facing the same things, and we've always been facing that in the United States as well.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on that and say that, to just echo that and say, I remember when I was growing up, when I was in like 6th grade, among the black people in Baltimore, the black African Americans, there was a particular disdain for Haitians, and I didn't see that at the time. I didn't understand that was the fulfillment of a long project, because Haiti's history in particular, Haiti so many times in American history, so many people refer to Haiti, so many politicians refer to Haiti as a cautionary tale, actually, right? we had to make sure that other nations didn't imitate the Haitian example. So I didn't see that connection when I was younger. But one other thing I want to mention is that one big element that's missing from our history is, I think, the history of black labor. Another way to talk about that is maybe like the history of, like what I might call the black radical tradition. And the black radical tradition is not only a history of people that we haven't heard of, but it's a different history of the people we have heard of. In the Black radical tradition, you learn about a different version of Martin Luther King than what you knew, right? And you learn about all kinds of other folks. And so I think that when you delve into the figures and delve into like what Martin Luther King was talking about, actually, you know, Martin Luther King came, as many of you probably know, to Buffalo in 1967 and gave a speech, right? And at that same time, he was talking about the Vietnam War. So there's a history that confronts nationalism, confronts patriotism, confronts capitalism, and looks at black people's struggles against those things, right? Which become really profound. I mean, we have a black history that kind of goes to Jim Crow and then kind of skips over that, and we just arrive for a lot of people at the Black Power movement, right? And we don't talk about what happened in the 20s. We don't talk about why was it that Langston Hughes, why was it that Claude McKay and all these other people were at the different times members of the Communist Party, right? And what were the processes and reasons why they left? Those kinds of, why was it that in Missouri and St. Louis, black women who were working as nut pickers took over the factory and struck and made the white women nut pickers follow them to get rights for all the nut pickers? Like, those moments are like erased. We don't know anything about that. And so I think that also, like, that absence contributes to a sense of, I think you know, it contributes to a lot of things that are missing, right? The wrong questions get asked, and we just kind of have this idea that everybody should be trying to be, quote unquote, a black Bill Gates in the making, right? Where you have Beyonce and all her brilliance, you know, bigging herself up by comparing herself to Bill Gates.
I'm not going to have the beehive coming after
I said she was brilliant. Brilliance. Beehive members, just letting you know. Oh, that's why you looked at me like he wasn't going to co-sign. I looked at him for the co-sign. You see that? He was like, nah, bro. Beyonce.
And we could talk about Jay-Z, but not Beyonce.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Well, that's a good transition to our next section, actually. So shall we? Oh, okay, great. Well, so our next section is one of the sections I really enjoyed in How to Be an Anti-Racist, talks about behavioral racism, right? Something that you're calling behavioral racism. So why don't I just allow you to go into how you're defining that?
Sure. So I think one of our difficulties as Americans in really understanding the complexity of racist ideas is I don't think we've been able to separate culture from behavior. And I think the way we can, I tried to sort of do this in the text. So culture, obviously, is something that groups do. Behavior is something that individuals do. Or another way to sort of understand this is you have so many different cultures, and many of the racial groups have, in many ways, a different type of culture. Every sort of racial group, though, with different cultures, have similar or the same behavioral traits. In other words, everyone loves, everyone hates, there's laziness, there's hard working, there's people who work hard. These are human traits that exist and operate differently in different cultures. In other words, the way people love is different in different cultures. And even the way people consider sort of work and hard work, or even laziness, or even violence, or even nonviolence, all of these different behavioral traits, which are the same because every racial group does it, is distinct, and it operates differently in different cultures. Does everybody sort of understand that? So what many sort of radicals and progressives over the course of American history have said is they've been able to see the fallacy of ranking certain cultures as better or worse than others. But what progressives and radicals have not been able to stop doing is articulating what in the text I call the oppression inferiority thesis. What this means is that people have long, progressives and radicals, I'm not talking about like, moderates or conservatives, I'm talking about people who imagine that they are the strongest forces against racism in this country. They have made the case that slavery wasn't just dehumanizing. It was so horrible that it literally made black people into subhuman brutes. That Jim Crow segregation wasn't just a debilitating, a destabilizing, a dispossessing institution. It literally destabilized black people. It literally led to inferior behavioral traits. Poverty isn't just an extremely harmful and dehumanizing set of conditions. It literally, that oppression that comes out of poverty literally leads to inferior behavioral traits. And this idea that literally slavery or even Jim Crow segregation or even poverty was so traumatic that it left black people, it made black people into a traumatized people who are now exhibiting all of these negative behavioral traits like violence and laziness and stupidity and others. That idea has actually never been proven. And it's actually the case that in oppressive conditions, individuals have different responses. So some individuals in traumatic, oppressive environments exhibit as a result of those conditions what people would classify as negative behavioral traits, while others work and strive and push harder. And we've only focused on the negative sort of output of these difficult conditions and not more or less recognized that other people have responded in different ways. We've also imagined that the way you convince America, the way you convince Americans that slavery is bad, that Jim Crow is bad, that poverty is bad, is basically saying, look how horrible this is, these people are now brutes. That's how Americans have imagined you convince people that these institutions, these racist policies are so bad, not realizing that they're opening the door to another set of racist ideas. Not realizing that if people believe that there's something inferior about black poor people, then they're not going to believe that all black poor people need is opportunities and resources. They're also going to believe that they need behavioral enrichment programs, that they need to be civilized and developed. They're also going to believe that the cause of racial inequities are not just their lack of opportunities and resources, that something else is happening. This was widely believed during the enslavement era. Radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison would travel around to places like Buffalo and talk about slavery as making these people into brutes. And so as a result, when emancipation came, when Americans started talking about civil and voting rights for formerly enslaved people, some of these radical abolitionists were like, no, actually, they need to be civilized first. They're just coming out of slavery. Slavery made them into brutes. We can't just give them civil and voting rights. We can't allow them to have reparations. They'll waste that away. And so then, because they imagined that there was something wrong with these people, they essentially resisted anti-racist policies. And people who are progressive and radical have long, in certain vantage points, resisted anti-racist policies based on what they thought was a radical idea.
Right. Can I just jump in? I think,
Sure.
I think this is a puzzle, though. When you hear these ideas rendered as clearly as Dr. Kendi is rendering them, they seem like, oh, of course that's wrong. But I actually think that these ideas, they're really among us, I think, in politics. I'm not going to talk about specific electoral things, but they're out there right now. They're still very much with us. But they're also with me when I grew up, and I think for really interesting reasons. One is people who I think black people and people who have a sense of the history and people who have been trying to do some forms of anti-racist work, it comes out of trying to get America to face and acknowledge the trauma of slavery, right? So, I mean, you're on an ongoing project to be trying to do anti-racist work to get folks to confront the reality of slavery. Like, that's still a thing that we really haven't done as a country yet, right? And the follow-up, not just slavery, but the regimes after slavery, you know, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, et cetera, right? You know, on and on and on. The current moment, mass incarceration, right? What is the trauma of it? So in trying to render that trauma real, we wind up producing this idea that folks are damaged by it, right? This idea of a damaged people. And then that becomes the basis. But it comes from that good intention. And even me as a storyteller and somebody who's making radio, I so often, when I'm trying to tell these stories, have to stop at the point when I'm invited to start making black trauma porn, you know, and through the narrative, right? And it's a complicated, nuanced thing. How do you show the reality without telling a story of a damaged people? The second thing comes from a different standpoint, which is the idea of, it really comes from a black nationalist political tendency, right? The sense that black people have had that they have to we have to take some self-determination for ourselves, right? So alongside of the tradition of social democratic struggle, where we're trying to transform America, and you see the NAACP and all these other people in that tradition, right? But then you see this other tradition that's saying we need separate institutions, because in the end of the day, history has shown us that maybe we can't really rely on white folk to do this for us. We need our own institutions, and we're trying to come to terms with the harm that we might be exhibiting in our own communities. So I think in that same way, I grew up with a nationalist discourse where black people were the harshest on other black people, and I was very much absorbed by that. And I was relating to some of the things that you write about in the book, you know, where by the time I got to college, if you heard me talk about race, it was probably me talking to black people saying the very same things that conservatives are saying, but coming from a black nationalist standpoint, right? And not seeing that actually I'm saying literally the same thing that they're saying, right? And so I think that one of the last piece I want to say about this is that this way of characterizing oppression is in opposition to what you were talking about. You talk about resources and opportunities. That's a redistributive project. That's a project where people who have power and resources are going to have to give that up. And so these discourses of behavior are really seductive and useful to people who don't really want to give power up. They love to characterize racism as just individual psychology problem, and they love to characterize it as a cultural issue, but they don't want to look at the redistributive aspect.
Well, part of it is also, let me just say two things. First, we've been trained, including black people, that when we see individual black negativity, we're not just seeing a single individual who is acting negatively.
Right.
We're seeing the entire black race. And in contrast, when people, including black people, see individual white negativity, they're only seeing one individual white person.
That's right.
And so what that creates is, if you're trained to do that, and you are a black person or a white person or any person, you're going to regularly see individual black people who are acting in a negative way from a behavioral standpoint. So then in your mind, you're going to be seeing what's wrong with black people in general regularly. It's going to then be substantiating these larger racist ideas that are essentially being mass-produced for your own consumption. But it's because we're making that, we're generalizing individual negativity. And so to be anti-racist is essentially to treat individuals as individuals. What also sort of happens is, I think it's absolutely sort of very, very, very difficult for people to recognize that at this core, when you have racial inequality of any sort, there's only two causes. There's only two causes. Either racist policies or racist ideas. Those are the only two causes. And what I mean by that is, for instance, the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate in this country has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate. There's only two explanations. Either there's something wrong with black workers, they're lazy, they're unqualified, they don't want to work, there's something wrong with black workers, or racist policies. Those are the only two explanations. And so many people, so we're literally taught to believe the explanation that the problem is people as opposed to policy. And we're taught that by the very people who are behind those policies because they want us going after other people as opposed to them. And so then it allows their policies and their power to persist as we're fighting each other, and ultimately, as their policies deepen the harm and thereby make the inequities worse, it then causes the people to deepen their critique of the people, and it becomes this vicious cycle, which is essentially happens in white America too. As white people struggle, they're taught that the cause of their struggle is people of color, and not the very people who they're supporting politically. And so the more they struggle, the more the very people who they're supporting politically are telling them those other people are the cause of your struggle. So then they grow to hate those people more. Then they grow to attack those people more and simultaneously support the very people who are actually harming them more. And it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. And it creates a scenario in which people literally feel the need to go and accumulate AK-47s and AR-15s to take these people out. Because that's how much they've been taught that their struggle, their harm is the result of these people. And then those very people who taught them that Latinx people are invading this country say, oh, that's not on me. As they constantly deny and deflect the racist ideas they're mass producing, the racist policies that are harming pretty much all Americans, and I think y'all understand what I'm saying. I can, let me stop there.
No. So I think, one of these behavioral discourses, one of the things that they do is they legitimize different kinds of forms of policing, and I think that's one area where we really need to bring it home to Buffalo. Now, I'm not from Buffalo, and I don't know this town very well, but I've been reading some very interesting work by journalists and activists here, some in the Investigative Post by Marsha McLeod. And this is one of the things to me that illustrates how, in my view, racism works, right? We imagine racism as like one racist police officer, right? Who's a bigot. And so the idea is if we can replace that police officer with a bigot, we can fix it, right? But what happens when your municipal budget goes from $500,000 related to traffic tickets to $2.8 million, right? Upon the creation of a particular traffic violation board, which happened here in Buffalo. What happens when your strike force, right, increases the kinds of harms that are done? What that means is that you can be an individual who doesn't actually have racist attitudes. But when you go to work, you're being told to oppress black people in Buffalo, right? When they look at where the strike force hit, it was predominantly, what did it say, like 40% in predominantly black tracks, right? Were being targeted by the strike force with all of these illegal and corrupt practices. I mean, I hate, the brother talked about language. I don't even like to use the word corrupt. I'm saying, when people talk about a broken system, this may sound facile, but I hear people use it all the time. When did policing work for black and brown people and women and all of that in American history? When did it break? Tell me the point where it broke. I mean, clearly something happened, right, around the time of the drug war. You know what I'm saying? Where we had massive incarceration, but it wasn't like it was working before that. I don't think we can argue it was working in the 60s and so forth. So I think that confronting that kind of racism, right? The racism that's happening. And by the way, I'm not talking about police shooting black people. I'm talking about everyday working class people, black, white, poor, brown, queer, being pulled over by traffic tickets, oppressed, and having their wages stolen by the city government. So I encourage you to read those reports if you haven't already. And I think that kind of racism is part of what we have to talk about, but that's what gets legitimized by the idea that these people, that cultures and behaviors are actually damaged and toxic and responsible for their own oppression. I guess I got to ask you another question now. I forgot what it is. I guess, could we talk about some of the specifics, because we are, we're here, we have this chance to study. So could we talk about the specific legacy of books like Dark Ghetto, or, the work of Oscar Lewis, like some of these anthropologists and people who kind of put this stuff out into the world?
Yes, I mean, essentially, this was some of the prominent sort of scholarship on poverty that emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s that was trying, in other books like The Other America by Michael Harrington. And these books were essentially trying to answer the question. In the 1950s, 1960s, the US economy is apparently humming, but at the same time, you have a tremendous number of people who are still poor, and then among those people who are poor, they're disproportionately Black and Latinx. Why? Again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Either there's something wrong with these people, and some of the scholars made the case, well, they're born into poverty, so they develop this culture of poverty. They develop these sort of ways of acting and thinking that actually causes them to pass on the poverty to the next generation. They teach their children not how to excel in the economic sphere, but how to essentially remain poor. So that's why they're poor. But others were making the case that it's actually expensive in this country to be poor, which keeps poor people poor. And simultaneously, poor people have, particularly Black poor people, who historically and definitely currently are more likely to live in neighborhoods with high concentrations of poverty. In other words, one of the major distinctions currently between white poverty and Black poverty is Black poverty is much more dense. In other words, when you have a Black poor person, chances are they're living in a neighborhood with a lot of poor people. A white poor person is less likely to live in a neighborhood with a high concentration of poverty. You take Chicago. A Black poor person is 10 times more likely to live in an impoverished neighborhood than a white poor person. 10 times more likely. And so what happens is, not only are you poor, your neighborhood's poor. Not only do you don't have an access to opportunities and resources due to your poverty, your neighborhood doesn't. So your sociologists call this the double burden, right? But we have been taught to blame poor people for being poor. That is the dominant ideology, particularly among middle income and upper income people who imagine that the reason why they are middle income and other people are poor is because they worked so hard and those poor people did not. No matter those poor people are working 70 hours a week, taking
jobs.
An hour and a half, 2 hours to and from their job on public transportation. No matter, forget all of that. I'm not even going to think about that. I'm working harder than they are, which is why I have more. And certainly for Black poor people, where you have this, Black people are lazy and poor people are lazy. So of course, poor Black people are really lazy, and they're more lazy than poor white people, which is why they're more poor than poor white people. I mean, you're talking about this sort of intersection of elitist and racist ideas, which ultimately devastates and denigrates the Black poor, which ultimately causes Americans, including Black elites, to view themselves as superior to the Black poor, which causes people to imagine that the reason why there are higher levels of violent crime in poor Black neighborhoods is because there's something wrong with those people. And and there's something animalistic and violent and criminal-like about these people. And so as a result, because they're like animals, the only thing we can do to stop the crime is cage them. And the only way we can cage them is by bringing in more cops. So the way we address violent crime is through more cops and more jails. But when you actually look at the data, which we don't do, but when you actually look at the data, you actually find that what's actually leading to the high levels of violent crime is not the blackness of the people. People ride by black neighborhoods and they just, oh, there's black people, so it must be dangerous, which means there's some relationship between blackness and crime and violence.
And the rising, the lowering of crime, like the crime rate does not correspond to the expansion of police either.
No, it doesn't. and so what's actually the case is you have black upper income neighborhoods, white upper income neighborhoods, Latinx upper income neighborhoods tend to have lower levels of violent crime than white lower income neighborhoods, and so on and so forth, which tells someone like me that this isn't a people problem as much as it's a poverty and unemployment problem. But we imagine such things as a dangerous black neighborhood, but what if we started imagining these neighborhoods as dangerous unemployed neighborhoods?
Yeah.
You see how that completely changes what the problem is and what the solution is? So instead of sending in more cops and more jails, we would send more high-paying jobs. And it just so happens that across... And I think Matt is going to talk about this too, but I mean, it just so happens that across the world, higher levels of unemployment, higher levels of violent crime. Right. No matter the country, no matter the race, no matter the ethnicity. It's a fact of human life. But we continue to imagine that this is about black people and this subculture of violence. Crime, yeah. And black people, black boys are raised without fathers, and so they just become these violent sort of demons and super predators. And every time we see a black male, we don't know, we're sort of fearful. But then when we see that white male who's headed to that mass shooting, we're not.
Thank you.
I think one of the interesting things would be to define what do we mean by race. When I think back to the immigration in the 20s, there were signs up that said no Irish need apply, so the Irish race was being excluded. But you don't see that anymore. What happened to make that better? Why don't we have Irish racial comments anymore?
So there's a great book entitled When the Irish Became White.
Yes.
And it talks about, and I think white people in particular, one of the reasons why I think it's very important to learn about white American history, whether you're reading a book like The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, or a series of other whiteness studies books, is you find that 100 years ago, at this time, the people who were being classified in the way Latinx immigrants are being classified today are precisely Irish and Italians and Jews and other white ethnic groups from Eastern and Southern Europe. And then, ironically, the very descendants of those people are now essentially saying the same thing, some of them, to Latinx and black immigrants. The huge irony, right? But ultimately, that book, and When the Jews Became White, and there are other books like that, it talks about the way whiteness expanded in the 1940s and 50s, particularly with the suburbanization of America, in which before the sort of suburbs emerged, you essentially had these white ethnic enclaves in cities. But then when whites started going out into the suburbs, essentially they started for the lack of the better term, breaking up those ethnic enclaves. And so what became the defining characteristic of the people in those suburbs, because black people were largely excluded, was their whiteness. And so I think it's critical for us to sort of know that history. I also think it's critical for us to know what I talk about in the text, what I call ethnic racism. And so essentially every race, you not only, every race is a collection of racialized ethnic groups. And within each race, those ethnic groups are ranked. In other words, certain white ethnic groups, even to this day, are considered superior to other white ethnic groups. In the same token, you have African Americans imagining that Nigerian Americans are inferior and Haitian Americans are inferior, while you have some Haitian and Nigerian Americans imagining that African Americans are inferior. So you have and these inferiorities, in many cases, at least with Black America, are based on people standardizing their own cultures or assessing who's mostly white. And so then you have this white standard in which who's most likely to be white is actually the most likely to be superior. Or who's most closest to Anglo-Saxon Americans in their culture are the most superior, quote unquote, white people. And so the ethnic racism or ethnocentrism has always intersected with racism to produce these massive hierarchies that still exist in our society.
The only thing I would add to that is there's a great book called The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Muhammad. And he talks about another feature, a key point in history, really. I think he's really focused like 1890s through like 1940s, about how people who collected crime data used sort of like these false data practices to produce a criminalizing narrative around Black people, and actually then later to take some of the white groups who at that point were criminalized, Irish, Jews, and other folks, and kind of clean their image up through the crime data, right? And all kinds of other things that happen from that. So that's another great book.
Yeah, so white people experienced the Progressive Era and Black people experienced Jim Crow.
So in talking about racism, we've been prompted to think about it as connected to capitalism, which seems productive and important. But, and you made the move about making a connection not to necessarily ignorance, but self-interest, which also seems to be a good move, makes sense. But it seems to me there's elements of racism that some authors have brought out in a very powerful way, like Bell Hooks, for example, that sees it as one of a triad of forces of oppression that we deal with. And in having a sophisticated understanding of racism, we want to see it not only as connected to class oppression in capitalism, but also gender oppression. So I wondered how you've encountered racist ideas that don't seem to also have these roots in capitalism and self-interest, but also in other forms of oppression that seem to be more connected to status, social status, rather than individualized self-interest.
So yeah, I mean, my book actually have a chapter on gender, have a chapter on sexuality, have a chapter on ethnicity, and I have a chapter on class, because I wanted to sort of point out precisely the way in which racism has constantly been reinforcing and being reinforced by homophobia and capitalism and sexism and ethnocentrism. And so as it relates to sort of gender, what we should sort of understand is that I sort of talk about in the text how you have these sort of gender or these sort of race genders. In other words, Black women are a race gender. Black men are a distinct race gender. These are two distinct racial groups, just as white women are a race gender and white men are a race gender. And the way in which racist ideas play out is they're constantly intersecting with sexist ideas to essentially rank those race genders. To give an example, sexist ideas suggest that the best women are the weakest women, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that's what sexist ideas suggest that, right? Yeah. racist ideas suggest that the most superior women are white women. Those two ideas intersect to make the case that what makes white women the most superior is their weakness. And what makes black women the most inferior is because they're strong, like men. You see the way that sort of works. So this idea of the weak white woman who is superior to the strong black woman who is like a man. And then what that does is you flip it around for white men and black men, because apparently the best and the most superior men are the strongest men. The most inferior men are the weakest men. The most superior men are white men. What makes white men the most superior men is that they're strong, and what makes black men the most inferior men is that they're weak. So these concepts, and I chronicle this in Stamped from the Beginning, and also in How to Be an Anti-Racist, the relationship between the strong white man and the weak black man, and the relationship between the weak white woman and the strong black woman, and the way in which that sort of operates and has operated historically to sort of denigrate particular groups, to justify inequities, and to sort of maintain the persistence of both sexism and racism.
Oh yeah, I'll say something later, go ahead.
As I listen, language is really important. And I hear sometimes, in terms of inferiority and superiority, you use the term American and how we automatically assume we're talking about the United States. And then you talk about the Americas, and there's that kind of distinction between the two, but that's not the main point. The main point is the distinction between emancipation and true freedom. How can you call yourself free when you're still under the jurisdiction of those same people who subjected you to 200, 300, 400 years of enslavement? Is there a point and is there a way that we can find true and complete freedom in or outside of the Americas?
Well, one thing I would say is, you know, just to try to weave that in together to what we were talking about before, the issue of gender, and to connect also to the person who talked about American education. One other big, massive hole in our education is the black feminist tradition, which is not something that has like exclusively produced like liberatory ideas related to black women, but for all oppressed people, right, coming out of that transition. The epistemology, I know that's like a, you know, but it's like just a way of understanding the world, right? And there's so many works I could describe. Bell Hooks was mentioned, the Combahee River Collective was mentioned. I think the work of prison abolitionists like Ruthie Gilmore, Angela Davis is crucial. I mean, people don't like the word abolition, but we're talking about democracy, right? Democracy is an aspirational project of being able to envision a world that doesn't exist, something America's never been before. And that requires an abolitionist epistemology, actually, right? So in that tradition. But one thing I want to say, too, is when you look at there's another scholar whose work I want to recommend. His name is Silvia Federici. And she talks about how capitalism requires certain kinds of roles for women, right? In the process, particularly because capitalism in its various iterations, right? Like when capitalism starts in Europe and and also in capitalism sort of as it gets going in the US, there's always a sense of needing to take over land to get the raw materials to make capital work, right? And that means that you have to dispossess people from the land. And often the kinds of people who have certain traditions around the land, women and women's cultures wind up playing particular roles around the land when you look at indigenous cultures that she was looking at. So she looks at witch trials and all these other things, but it's really important because she talks about how we get the kind of domesticity and what that has to do with capitalism's origins. One last thing I want to say is nationalism is something we should talk about too. Again, going back to my college self, your book has a lot of biography in it. I don't know if you want to talk about this too. When I was, if you picture me in college, this was my understanding. Black people need a black nation to counter American racism. Okay, maybe not, okay. But what the black nation meant was we need a black man, a black woman. The black woman has to play her role. Everybody has to be heterosexual, nuclear family, right? And what was so ironic and twisted was that this discourse was often posed as lifting up black women, right? I'm like, black women is the queen because you're the cornerstone of our nation. As long as you're at home making babies and working, and so I can be out marching and professing things that I haven't, books I probably ain't even read, right? And ironically, this link that you see in black nationalism with where the black woman and some black nationalist traditions, and again, I'm lumping things together here, but in some versions of black nationalism, there's a really oppressive patriarchal thing going on. That's also the case with American nationalism, right? This turns out to be a character of nationalism, period, is that the woman and the woman's body is always required to do certain things to further the nation. See, so this is why we have to get outside and go to some of these radical traditions, because it's only in those radical feminist traditions and in some of these other traditions that you get a critique of nationalism, right? You have to be able to say, like, what happens, can we envision a world beyond just making America anything? And actually just looking at what nationalism does and how that connects to patriarchy. So I wanted to toss that in there.
Oh, and I mean, to add, I think that one of the ways this sort of operated was this construct of this sort of rigid, strong black woman has emasculated black men. And so in this, quote, new nation, the black male will thereby reign supreme and take his rightful place as the head of the household, like a white man. So what was actually happening is you had these black men who essentially wanted to be white men and argued that they were being oppressed as black men because they did not have control of their women like white men had control of their women. There's this long-standing tradition. And so ultimately, those black men were simultaneously making the case that they were anti-racist. And they weren't using that term, but they imagined, right, that this was fighting racism, that they were challenging racism, when they were only challenging their own perception of what racism is, their lack of the ability to essentially be patriarchs. So white men, you're not allowing us to be patriarchs. So you're oppressing us. And not all black men were obviously doing this, but those who were essentially seeking to assimilate. They were seeking to become white men. At the same time, and that's precisely what black feminists said. And then they, of course, would get very upset. No, I don't want to be like white men. And, it would, of course, get into a very interesting back and forth. But one quick thing about language that I think is absolutely critical. When I think about my work, the most important facet that language operates is for me to communicate. And so what I'm fundamentally focused on is, will people be able to understand what I'm saying? And how do I simultaneously use words that can adequately sort of frame and utilize the complexities of what I'm trying to say in a way that everyday people can understand? And I think one of the things that scholars in particular have gotten away from is not fundamentally ensuring that their work is accessible. And when we use words that people don't understand and then blame them for not understanding our work, because, and I didn't mean that. Let me stop there.
No, keep going, bro.
No, I mean, to me, and so I think that it's absolutely critical for us to meet people where they are.
Well, okay, but so just
conceptually,
just for the sake of dancing, first of all, I totally agree with this. So, but I think the danger, right, that I see as a professor in the humanities now, right, is that oppressed people all over the world, working class people, black people, people who always didn't have the access to formal education, despite that, have had rich intellectual traditions of study, right? I mean, you look at so many within the movement. I mean, so many of our people in the movements from the Black Panthers, they're reading very dense theory right? These people are reading like, Lenin and all kinds of critical theory, from the Frankfurt School. I mean, they're very, very well-read folks. And our people, and even if you go to the kind of movements that Robin D.G. Kelley talks about, right, in Hammer and Hoe, you see black Southern folks down there deeply studying theories that have to do with capitalism and liberation. So I fully agree, and I love your work because it's so accessible. In the academy, what I worry about is that there's a movement coming from, it's coming from capitalism as translated through the STEM fields, right? To say the humanities are not important. Mm-hmm. All the humanities do is they kind of like throw out these big words, and they're just off in their sort of intellectual worlds. And I agree with you that what we have to try to do is to find a way to make that work accessible, but at the same time, there's a place for theory. There's a word, there's an expression that says nothing's more practical than a good theory, right? Like you look at bell hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, they are theorists, right? And so I think that we have to also have high, I agree with you, when it gets into blaming our people, like y'all don't read and y'all don't do that, that's unproductive. But I also believe in our ability to absorb the most dense material as well.
Well, yeah, and I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, we're in agreement, yeah.
Because to me, I see, so let's say you engage as a scholar in some of the most dense and even complicated sort of theory or even sort of empirical data or, history. And then what you could do is essentially reproduce that on the page as you're reading it and as you're seeing it. Or what you can do is you can take another step as a scholar and clarify all of those complexities that you're thinking and reading and understanding in a way to make it accessible. And so that's, to me, what's absolutely critical, because it's much harder to do that, obviously, to take a very sophisticated theory and essentially clarify it in a way that people can understand without losing none of the complexity of the theory. That is very, very difficult to do, but I'm saying that that's what we must do, particularly as it relates to racism, since it literally is one of the lethal weapons threatening human existence.
Absolutely, yes. I think your books do that excellently. I've learned from it. I hope my podcasts do it a little bit as well in there. I think, but I want to switch to the topic of capitalism. So you have a chapter where you're talking about class, and you make some claims that I think are could be provocative for some people. You say that racism and capitalism are kind of like conjoined, right? They're always linked, and that therefore the fight against either must be conjoined. I don't know if I'm understanding this properly. So I'm interested in how that strikes me as something that, I don't know, maybe in this room, like you say something like that and people just kind of go, yeah, but I'm like, do we all agree on that? I don't know if everybody agrees on that, right? Like I'm listening to our political discourse and some people seem like they're still, very much, I think the sense I have is that the dominant feeling is, I'm definitely anti-racist, and I think really greedy corporations are bad, but maybe let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like that's kind of the sense I get, right? So I guess what I'm interested for you is could you talk about how understanding capitalism historically and its links to racism kind of interacts with that kind of idea?
Yeah, so, I wasn't necessarily trained in Marxist theory. I'm not necessarily making a Marxist argument. What I mean by that is I'm not making an ideological argument. What the argument that I'm making in the class chapter is both historical and empirical. And so historical, unlike, I think we talked about patriarchy existed in the ancient world. Patriarchy is not necessarily a new phenomenon. But when you look at the history of racism and capitalism, they emerged in the same century, in the same place, through the slave trade. And it grew through colonialism and slavery. And so when you sort of talk about its origins and its growth and its persistence, you can't really separate racism from capitalism, if you're being honest. And the reason why I say honest is because, I shouldn't say honest, some people have a different definition of capitalism and a different historical conception of capitalism. Some people would argue that capitalism is just markets. Capitalism is sort of operating for a profit. Capitalism is essentially the sort of reinvestment, I should say the accumulation and reinvestment of capital. Some people would argue it's just supplying and demanding. And then people who are historians would say there was profit, there was markets, there was supplying and demanding before the modern world. What changed in the modern world? What changed? And so when you start to look at what changed, first you recognize that capital became global. And then you also begin to see that the accumulation of capital became so massive relative to other places, to other times in human history. And then you begin to ask the question, why? How did capital and why did capital go global? And why was there such a massive accumulation of capital in the hands of a small few in the same place? How did that happen? And you can't separate the slave trade, colonialism, and slavery from that. Then when you actually look at currently the way in which poverty and wealth operates in the United States and around the world, you can't separate discussions of wealth and poverty from discussions of race. In other words, you can't talk about economic inequality without talking about racial inequality. Poverty, black people are 3 times more likely to be poor in this country. And that has actually been a statistic that has been relatively stagnant over the course of history. In other words, black people have always been disproportionately poor, while white people have always been disproportionately rich. Africa has always been disproportionately poor in the modern era, and Europe has always been disproportionately rich. Wealth, you can't separate sort of wealth from whiteness, whether you're talking about in the United States or across the world. And then again, the question becomes, why? Why is it that we can't separate wealth from whiteness, and increasingly wealth from East Asia? Why is that the case? What is actually happening? What is China doing that Europe was long doing? Well, it just so happens that China is colonizing rapidly Africa and Latin America in the way in which Europe had long done, and extracting that wealth, right? How are they doing that? And so, I think we have to have an honest discussion about the history and definition of capitalism, just like we have to have an honest discussion about the history and the definition of racism. But we don't want to have those discussions because they're politically loaded terms. And people, particularly people who are in positions of power, whether political or economic power, they view it as as potentially harmful to them if they speak out against capitalism, if they treat capitalism as it's actually functioning. They'll be labeled as a socialist, or they'll be labeled as an anti-capitalist, and then they'll apparently lose elections, even though the majority of Americans actually favor socialism currently. And so what I'm saying ultimately is that when you talk about how Europe became rich, how did Europe become rich? Now, some people would say it became rich because, innovation and technological change and industrial revolution and the ingenuity and the intelligence of European people. That's in order to make the case that capitalism is not essentially racist, you essentially have to make that case, that Europe became rich because of all of those factors we just named. But all of the data and all of the evidence points to the slave trade, colonialism, and slavery for how Europe became rich. And then you can't deny that those were essentially racist institutions, that they were essentially governed by racist policies. You can't deny, for instance, that a French company like De Beers is able to bring wealth into France because it owns diamond mines in Botswana. And then when you start talking about how and why are they able to own diamond mines in Botswana, why is it that the Congo is the richest country in the world below ground? One of its minerals, one mineral in the Congo, 75% of the world's deposits for this mineral that is essential for all computers and cell phones, 75% of the world's deposits is in the Congo. And it's one of the poorest countries in the world. How? Why? Why is that the case? Who owns those minefields? Who owns the diamonds in the Congo? And so why is it that Congolese leaders have been in the civil war for the last 30 years? Who benefits from that? I mean, we can talk about this all day, but I think people don't want to have an honest conversation about how you become wealthy and the way in which racist policies have been essential to the wealth of not only the super rich, but even the white middle class. Whether you talk about New Deal or GI policies, whether you talk about living in a white neighborhood now, suddenly the value of your home is going to increase more than the equal stock in a black neighborhood, when the only difference is the whiteness of that neighborhood. That's a function of racism. And so you have this accumulation of wealth. Anyway, I'm sorry. But let me.
I just want to clarify, that's the not Marxist on the stage.
Well, I'm just speaking facts. Like, to me, this isn't an ideological argument.
Yeah, but no, and I mean, I think that the long tradition of critiques of capitalism, of which Marx is a part, is also a historical analysis, right? A particular analysis of history, right? That's just facts that we have to wrestle with and confront. And I think that one of the things that's different about this moment is because you have generations of people who are sort of facing right now like an economy, you know, where the job availability is not to their satisfaction, and they're seeing all these different sort of manifestations of capitalism and other ways that markets are at work. People are actually reading facts now and forming their own opinions, and so we can have a conversation. I think that the term anti-capitalist leaves room for people to have a lot of different conversations about what comes next. But I think that what I think it also captures, which is really important, so let's suppose that you're someone who's a total pro-capitalist evangelist, free markets, you know, those kinds of things. What you cannot deny, another similar set of facts, is that in American history, those who have tried to stop racist oppression have found themselves against capital, time and time again, right? And that's in some ways part of the history of like black labor struggle, you see that. But even now, like I mentioned, for example, in Philadelphia or in cities, if you want to try to confront the schools, you want to confront school funding disparities, you will find yourself going up. In Philly, we find ourselves against the forces of capital. It's developers who have captured the local government, who can lobby for certain kinds of tax abatement policies, tax giveaways, and things like that, right? If you look at housing, right, obviously it's, again, real estate developers and real estate capital arguing for zoning policies that disproportionately affect black and brown people. And then it winds up being, you know, basically socialist tenant unions who are fighting on behalf of those citizens, stopping their houses, stopping them from getting evicted, right? So like you don't have to say, I don't like capitalism, but you have to accept the fact that the people who are critiquing capitalism are the ones fighting those battles, just like feminists are fighting patriarchy and domestic and just sexual violence and violence against women, period, right? And then when you talk about, obviously, in the workplace, right, the oppressions in the workplace, whether it's ride-sharing oppression, you know, the kinds of policies that ride-sharing companies are making billions of dollars. So many of those workforce, you go to Seattle, you go to Philly, a huge chunk of those workers who are driving those are immigrants, right, and black and brown people. So on every front, what you see is the people who are trying to fight different types of racism wind up facing off against capital. Without a critique of capital, then you're ill-equipped to try to fight those battles.
And I think one other thing that oftentimes happens, particularly with black people, is you have people who self-identify as black capitalists,
right,
who urge black people to essentially accumulate more wealth and more income. On this theory, that as you rise on the economic ladder, you're going to be less likely to have to deal with the stranglehold of racism. And so that's how we sort of lift black people out of the stranglehold of racism, is through the accumulation of wealth. What they don't understand is the data. And what actually happens is data actually demonstrates the very opposite. That as black people rise on the economic ladder, they're actually more likely to face racist policies. They're actually more likely to be tattered with racist ideas. And so it actually, so you can't necessarily escape it. Even black billionaires, who I know have faced racist policies, who have faced racist ideas. And so this idea that you can somehow escape it through capitalism, right, through ascending in capitalism, statistically and empirically and evidentially, has actually never shown itself to be the case. And then what happens is, so you're a black person who is rising on the economic ladder, and you're still facing racist ideas, you're still facing racist policies, and you become bitter because you don't, of course, recognize the relationship between racism and capitalism. Instead, you blame black people. They're looking and harming me because of what y'all are not doing. So then you don't sort of recognize that your own ideas, particularly about the black poor, denigrating the black poor, are the very racist ideas that are used to actually attack you and basically call you an exception, an extraordinary sort of Negro. And so I think that, and so there's really no escaping it.
Right. There's not only is the sort of the black billionaire, if there's really not much of a black billionaire class, but the black wealthy class.
There's 12 in the
there's
in the
12.
world.
I don't know how many you need to get a class. But we have to also talk about the way that blackness, like your book helps us to destabilize these ideas of blackness and whiteness. And what we can see is that the concept of blackness lets us believe that black wealthy people have the same interests, economic interests, as black poor people, because somehow we're just all black. And that also, the facts have not borne that out. I'm writing a book right now that looks at a lot of these kinds of politics. So for example, I hate to do this, but I love the rapper Nipsey Hussle, okay? But in LA, his entrepreneurship was being deeply celebrated. And I believe that Nipsey was trying to help the black community, okay? But let's look at what those entrepreneurial efforts were when you actually look at the facts. Erecting a mixed-use high-rise in Crenshaw, in an area where the median income is $42,000. And we know what happens to property values. Working with the LA Metro to help bring the train through Crenshaw, right? I mean, literally, and then partnering with his developer, David Gross, who's a black real estate developer, again, somebody who's basically makes money from charging rent to black people, right? Now, he's also, they're talking about using opportunity zones, which is really a tax giveaway. It's ensuring that the money that's invested in that neighborhood will not go back into the neighborhood because you're not going to be paying taxes, right? So if all these strategies were being done by a white person, they would immediately be recognized as the harbingers of gentrification, okay? But when you put a black face on it, and now suddenly it's a black empowerment strategy, And this is not to take down black people that want to help and support, right? But it's to say that we have to use some of this vocabulary you're giving us to develop a more sophisticated understanding if we really want to help the masses of black people, right? And not just subject them to exploitation with a black face.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, one of the more fascinating books that I've read over the last few years, and I'm sure some of you have read, was entitled Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And it sort of talks about in Milwaukee, and it sort of uses Milwaukee as a case study of essentially how many people across this country, and of course he specifically was looking at not only black but even white people, but how many people are basically being evicted. And this is a massive crisis. And one of the reasons why so many people are being evicted is because of rents are so damn high. And who are some of the people who are charging these exorbitant rents to working class and poor black people in black neighborhoods? Black people. And then who is stating that the reason why these people can't pay their rent is because there's something wrong with them? They're black landlords. So they're combining with white landlords to sort of make the case that the reason why there's this eviction problem, the reason why there's this homeless problem, is because there's something wrong with black poor people. They're saying the same ideas, benefiting in the same way, but we're only calling one group racist. And what I'm saying is, if anybody's saying there's something wrong with black people, if anybody's executing policies that are harming black people or any other racial group, they're being racist.
Hi, I hope I didn't jump out of the flow, but I'm Nanette Massey. Hi, how are you?
Hey.
Been reading your books, checking you out all over YouTube and everything. All kinds of praises for you and all that. I've got two ideas that I want to throw out at you, and you might have to pick one or the other. All right. One is I do some workshops and some seminars around Buffalo, where I talk to white audiences about having effective conversations about race. And I'm finding that people are flocking to these workshops, but at the end, it kind of becomes an exercise in white people simply, all what we're doing now around whiteness studies and so on, it becomes an exercise in white people simply contemplating their own navel and its relevance to the universe. Am I making sense? Okay. So what would you say about why it is important for white people to get past that? Why it's important in the bigger picture. Okay, that's one. Because I won't hear it from me or anybody local. While you're here, we get to have you say it. All right. The other one, we were talking about the intersection of race and class and gender and all of that. And it reminded me of a book I read in the 90s by Jewel Woods called Don't Blame It on Rio. Do you know about that one? No?
Yeah.
He was talking about where black high-achieving men are going to Rio to vacation in Rio because they get beautiful women who lavish all and so on and so forth. And I have an essay that I wrote about that I would love to get to you. So if you have some handlers in here that I get an email address or something like that, that'd be great. All right, so Don't Blame It on Rio, or like I said, white people studying their navel. Pick one of those two.
White people studying their what?
Studying their navel.
Their navel?
Navel-gazing, yeah.
Whiteness studies.
Like the white guilt,
Whiteness studies staying within itself as
Yeah.
opposed to moving on to something helping the larger good.
Yeah. So I think in the first scenario, I do think it's critical for white people to understand the way whiteness operates in this country and the way their whiteness has operated in their own lives. But that's really only a first step. And if one is only sort of recognizing their own sort of white privilege or recognizing the ways in which their white group has been, quote, pressed to, and essentially they're not moving to recognize the ways in which they too potentially have consumed anti-black racist ideas, anti-Latinx racist ideas, and they're not confessing those ideas, and they're not in turn recognizing that the reason why we have these disparities is not because there's something wrong with these people of color, and then realizing that the real cause is racist policies, and then from there being a part of the movement locally and in this state and nationally to challenge those racist policies, if they're not doing all of that, then they're being racist. And if I can just say, that's why I said earlier, a racist is not only someone who's supporting racist policies with their action, but also their inaction. If you have a nation, if you have a community of racial inequity, and you do nothing in the face of that racial inequity, you are essentially allowing that racial inequity to persist. Slaveholders wanted people in Buffalo to do nothing in the face of slavery. Mississippi segregationists wanted people in Buffalo to do nothing in the face of Jim Crow. People today want white Americans, like other Americans, to do nothing in the face of racist power and policy, because they know if you do nothing, racism lives. If you challenge racism, racism has the likelihood to die. And those who are challenging racism are being anti-racist, and those who are allowing racism to live through actual support or doing nothing are being racist.
All right. Well, I'm a climate activist, so you'll pardon me if I think about everything as relating somehow to climate change.
Yes.
Through my work, I've learned about environmental racism. And I was wondering how you felt environmental racism factors into the history of racism in America, and how now, as we approach impending climate doom, we can address environmental racism as a society.
So, I mean, I actually think that there are three lethal weapons threatening human existence: nuclear war, bigotry, and climate change. And I don't think people sort of realize how close humanity is to its Armageddon as a result of bigotry, as a result of climate change, and as a result of a politician pressing a red button for nuclear holocaust. And so, obviously, I actually also would say, specifically to climate change, before we talk about environmental racism, that those who are literally fighting against climate change, those climate activists, are actually in many ways being anti-racist. Because when you look at the effects of climate change, it's actually having a disproportionately negative effect on the global south. And that global south is from Latin America to the Indian subcontinent to Mississippi and Florida. And so really, to really fight the climate fight is really to essentially save the bottom half of the world, which is already now sinking. And anytime we're really fighting to create, fighting and defending people of color or fighting against racial injustice, which climate change fundamentally is, we're being anti-racist. Another quick thing I'll say is that one of the ways I've actually connected with climate scientists and activists is we talk about how essential denial is to the climate fight and to racism. And that the way in which denial functions is very similar in both. It's not only the denial of climate change and racism, but it's also essentially the elimination of something called science and truth. And what happens is the individual is able to essentially determine whether it's warming based on weather changes on a particular day. Just like the individual who sees one black person on TV is able to determine that racism doesn't exist. And then that very individual rejects climate science, rejects racial science, and then imagines, it's not that bad. And the individual is able to essentially determine what is actually happening in their life. And this certainly happens with race. Every person thinks they're a racial expert. And it's difficult for people who study racism when people say, well, this is what I think. And I'm like, that's great, but here is all of the empirical evidence and evidentiary evidence that's critical for you to sort of understand. But then when you sort of explain that, they get upset. Because this isn't a relationship between, like, you know, a cancer patient and an oncologist. You're just talking and I'm just talking, right? And so I think it's critical for us, as we fight racism and as we fight climate change, to fight against those, including ourselves, when we imagine that we are all experts about everything, and that there's no such thing as science, there's no such thing as data, there's no such thing as truth. We as individuals get to determine what is truth. That is extremely flawed, and that will lead to the elimination of humankind.
Absolutely. I just want to say, this is really important. Tomorrow is like a global climate strike, right? Are there things going on? Are there things going on in Buffalo? Can somebody please come up to the mic and announce what's going on in Buffalo briefly? I'm sorry, it's just too important.
Tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, 2 to 5 in Niagara Square, we are holding the Youth Climate Strike and a celebration of International Peace Day with the Western New York Peace Center and various other organizations. Yay!
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our conversants. Wonderful. And for yourselves. Thank you.